Revenge office stories. The entire data center was melting down, costing the company millions of dollars a minute, and I was the only person who could have stopped it. So why didn't I? Because a week earlier, my boss had personally walked me to the door and disabled my badge. He told me my services were no longer required. He was wrong. He was catastrophically, apocalyptically wrong. This isn't a story about sabotage. I didn't plant a virus or cut a wire. This is a story about inaction. It's the story of how my quiet, calculated revenge led to a complete system-wide failure and taught a multi-billion-dollar corporation a lesson they couldn't possibly ignore. Let me take you back, not just a week, but a decade. I was the lead systems architect for a company we'll call Innovate Corp. Generic name, I know, but their business was anything but. They handled staggering amounts of data, financial transactions, secure client information, global shipping logistics. If data was the new oil, Innovate Corp was one of the world's biggest refineries, and I was the one who designed and maintained the entire facility, the data center. It wasn't just a room full of servers. It was the company's heart, its brain, and its central nervous system. For 10 years, my job was to make sure that heart never, ever skipped a beat. When I first started, I was 25, fresh-faced, and one of the only women on the engineering team. I poured everything I had into that job. I didn't just understand the systems. I knew them. I knew their quirks, their pressure points, the subtle hum of a server rack that meant everything was okay, and the almost imperceptible change in pitch that signaled a fan was about to fail. My old boss, a guy named David, used to call me the data center whisperer. He was old school and understood that technology is only as good as the people who manage it. He trusted me implicitly, and I was fiercely loyal to him and the company. For 10 years, I was the first call day or night. Christmas Eve, 3 a.m., a critical storage array was throwing up weird read/write errors. I spent 4 hours on a grainy video call with a tech in a freezing data hall, walking him through a command line fix that wasn't in any manual. I wrote the recovery script on the fly, saving them from what would have been catastrophic data corruption. The company saved millions. I got a thank you email and a coffee shop gift card. Another time, a major software patch from a vendor had a hidden bug, so subtle it only appeared under a very specific high-load condition. I noticed a tiny, almost trivial memory leak. Everyone else said it was statistical noise. I insisted. I spent a weekend building a sandboxed environment to replicate the issue, proved the bug existed, and developed a workaround just hours before the end-of-quarter processing rush would have triggered it. That failure would have crashed our entire client transaction platform. It would have been front-page news. Instead, nobody outside my team ever knew. My reward? A pat on the back and the quiet satisfaction of knowing I'd kept the ship afloat. My life was a series of these quiet saves. I wasn't just an architect. I was the institutional knowledge of that entire infrastructure personified. The monitoring systems, the alert protocols, the failover procedures. I hadn't just learned them. I designed most of them myself. I wrote custom scripts that watched over the hardware like guardian angels, predicting hard drive failures from spin-up times or flagging a power supply that was drawing a fraction of a watt more than it should. This wasn't off-the-shelf stuff. It was bespoke, born from years of obsessive experience. At 35, I was at the peak of my career. I was damn good, and I thought that mattered. Then David retired, and everything changed. The new guy's name was Brad. Brad wasn't a tech guy. Brad was an MBA. He walked in with a shiny suit, a blindingly white smile, and a vocabulary that consisted entirely of words like synergy, optimization, and streamlining. He saw the IT department not as the company's engine, but as a cost center. And he saw me, with my senior title and decade of tenure, as the biggest expense on his spreadsheet. His first week, he called me into his glass-walled office. "Sarah," he began, leaning back like a king, "I've been looking at your team's budget. It's substantial. I'm looking for efficiencies. We need to be more agile, more lean. I tried to explain. Brad, the budget is what it is because we have zero tolerance for downtime. We prevent problems. We don't just react to them. He smiled that empty, infuriating smile. Yes, proactive. Great word. But I see a lot of legacy systems. Custom scripts. We need to standardize. Move to off-the-shelf solutions. Something I can explain to the board in 2 bullet points. He didn't get it. He saw my custom scripts not as a finely tuned immune system, but as a liability. He saw my deep knowledge not as an asset, but as a bottleneck. He wanted to rip out the specialized engine I'd spent a decade building and replace it with a generic motor he could get a service contract for. The next few months were a slow-motion nightmare. He'd second-guess my decisions in front of my team. He'd cancel purchase orders for critical replacement parts to sweat the assets. I'd send him a detailed risk assessment, and he'd reply, "Let's circle back next quarter." He started bringing in his own people, consultants who spoke his language of buzzwords and produced beautiful reports saying we could cut the IT budget by 30% by decommissioning redundant systems. They weren't redundant. They were the failovers. They were the safety nets. The final showdown was over a set of industrial-grade, uninterruptible power supplies, the UPS systems. Think of them as giant batteries that keep the data center alive for the few critical minutes it takes for the backup generators to spin up during a blackout. They are arguably one of the most critical links in the chain. Our supplier had issued a service bulletin, a strong recommendation for a firmware update and an inspection of the capacitor banks on our specific model. They'd seen a handful of failures in the field under high-temperature conditions. I flagged it to Brad. "This is non-negotiable," I told him. "The cost is minimal, a few thousand for the service call. The risk of not doing it is a total power failure." He looked at the quote. "A few thousand for an inspection." "Sarah, this is the vendor scaremongering I'm here to eliminate. The system is working fine. We'll put it in the budget for next year." I couldn't believe it. "Brad, this isn't about money. It's about risk. Human error is a leading cause of these outages, and ignoring a warning like this is a huge one. If the city power grid fails during a summer heat wave and these things go, the whole data center goes dark. Not a graceful shutdown, a hard power off. We could lose millions an hour. For a company our size, major outages can cost upwards of $20,000 a minute." He held up his hand. "I've heard you. I'm managing the budget now and I'm making the call. It's deferred." He turned back to his computer. Dismissed. I stood there for a moment, and in that instant I made a decision. I bypassed him. I emailed his boss, the CTO, and the company's risk management officer with my assessment and a stark warning. It was a breach of the chain of command, but my loyalty wasn't to Brad. It was to the company's stability. That was my mistake. Not the technical assessment, but believing that competence still mattered more than ego. The next morning, I was called into HR. Brad was there looking smug. "Sarah," the HR rep said in a flat tone, "we're letting you go. Your role as lead systems architect has been eliminated." I was stunned. Eliminated? Who's going to manage the data center? Brad spoke up, that chilling smile on his face. "We're moving to a more streamlined, team-based approach. Your confrontational style and resistance to new methodologies are just not a good fit for our culture going forward." Confrontational style. That's what he called it. I saved them from disaster a dozen times. But because I stood up to an incompetent fool, I was confrontational. Security was already waiting. They walked me to the front door in a humiliating parade, past my colleagues. At the security desk, the guard took my badge and swiped it through a degausser. The little green light that had granted me access to the heart of the company for 10 years turned a permanent, final red. I was out. The first 24 hours were a blur of shock and white-hot fury. But as the shock wore off, something else took its place. A strange, chilling calm. The anger cooled, hardened, and sharpened into a single thought. They have no idea what they've just done. They thought they'd fired an obsolete engineer. What they'd actually done was remove the single, most important component in their entire infrastructure, the human failsafe. They'd unplugged their own smoke detector because it was making a noise they didn't like. And I knew, with absolute certainty, a fire was coming. That UPS service bulletin wasn't just a recommendation. It was a ticking time bomb. I knew the model, its vulnerabilities, and exactly what would trigger the failure. A sustained high ambient temperature and a significant power fluctuation. A city-wide brownout during a summer heat wave. I went through the motions of a person who just lost their job. Updated my resume, called recruiters. But my real focus was elsewhere. You don't build a fortress without knowing where the public-facing windows are. I couldn't access my old internal dashboards, but I knew which services had public status pages and which third-party sites pinged our servers. I cobbled together a crude, external-only version. It was like diagnosing a heart condition by looking at the color of a patient's skin, but it was enough to see the vitals. A week went by. I had an interview with a direct competitor. They were practically salivating. The company that had just thrown me away had, in the process, advertised my value to the entire industry. All the while I was watching the weather forecast and the company's own press releases. That's when I saw it. Innovate Corp was launching a massive new marketing campaign the following Wednesday. I knew what that meant. A huge, sustained spike in server load. More processing, more heat. Then I checked the 10-day forecast. Next Wednesday, the peak of a predicted heat wave, with temperatures soaring into the triple digits. High load, high heat. All that was missing was the final ingredient. The waiting was the hardest part. Part of me, the engineer who'd spent her life preventing failure, was screaming, "You have to warn them." But the other part, the part that remembered Brad's smirk, whispered, "Asterisk, this is not your problem anymore. This is the natural consequence of their own actions. Asterisk." The day before the launch, my phone rang. It was a junior engineer I had mentored, Mike. He sounded nervous. "Hey, Sarah, weird question. Do you remember the service schedule for the Alpha 1 PDU cluster?" He meant the UPS systems. My blood ran cold. "Why are you asking, Mike?" "Well, it's hot in here. Like really hot. I saw an old alert you configured about a recommended firmware update for the alphas. I asked my manager, and he said Brad deferred it. Is that a big deal?" This was it. My chance to be the hero one last time. I thought about it for a full 10 seconds. I thought about my old boss, my team, then I thought about Brad's face and my 10 years of loyalty being repaid with a 5-minute HR script. "Listen, Mike," I said, my voice perfectly calm. "I am no longer an employee of Innovate Corporation. I don't have access to those systems or their documentation. You'll have to direct your questions to your current management." A stunned silence. "Oh, okay. Sorry to bother you." "It's no bother," I replied. "Good luck with the launch." I hung up. I had made my choice. I wasn't their safety net anymore. Now all I had to do was watch. ####, Section 4. Climax, the meltdown. Wednesday morning. The day of the launch. I had my makeshift dashboard on one monitor and a live feed of the local power grid on another. The campaign went live at 9 a.m. The first sign of trouble was sluggish response times on their main site, normal for a launch. But behind the scenes, processors were spooling up, dumping immense heat into the data center. The strained air conditioning units were fighting a losing battle. At 10:17 a.m. it happened. A flicker on the grid monitor. A brownout in the data center's industrial sector. For a well-maintained facility, it would have been a non-event. But Innovate Corp was no longer a well-maintained facility. I didn't see the failure, but I saw its shadow. One of my external monitors went red. Status: host unreachable. My heart hammered in my chest. This was it. In my mind, I saw it all. The brownout hits. The load transfers to the UPS. but the firmware is faulty and the heat stress capacitors can't handle the sudden demand. The UPS cluster doesn't just fail, it shorts out, tripping the main breakers. For that critical 90-second window needed for the diesel generators to spin up, there was nothing, just silence. A few seconds later, another server went red, then another, then 5 more. It was a wave of digital death. Authentication servers first, then the web servers, then the databases. It was a cascading failure of epic proportions. Without those systems, the company had effectively been erased from the internet. My phone rang. Unknown number. I let it go to voicemail. It rang again. Ignored. Then a text from Mike. Asterisk Sarah, please pick up. Everything is down. Nobody knows what to do. Asterisk. Then the calls came from numbers I did recognize. Panicked managers, former colleagues. I ignored them all. Then the phone rang and the caller ID said Brad. I smiled. I let it ring 5 times, just to let the panic marinate. Then I answered. Hello. Sarah. Thank God. Are you seeing this? The whole system is down. He was shouting, his voice tight with pure terror. Oh my, I said, feigning surprise. That sounds terrible. What happened? I don't know. It all just went dark. The emergency power didn't kick in. We're blind, Sarah. We're losing millions every minute. I need you here. I need you to tell us what to do. I could hear the chaos in the background, shouting alarms. The soundtrack to my vindication. Well, that's certainly a problem, I said with faux sympathy. Have you tried rebooting? Rebooting? Sarah, this isn't a desktop. This is a complete data center failure. I can fix this. I'll approve whatever you want. Double your salary. Just tell me how to fix this. I paused, letting the silence hang. Brad, I said, my voice now cold as ice. I'm a little confused. You told me my confrontational style was no longer a fit. You had security walk me out. You disabled my badge. Sarah, please, this is not the time, he pleaded. I let out a small, quiet laugh. Brad, I said, savoring every word. My badge is disabled. I no longer have access. This sounds like a problem for your current, streamlined team to handle. I wish you the best of luck. And I hung up. The silence that followed was more satisfying than the chaos. I could picture the frantic, fruitless attempts to do a cold start. Without the proper sequencing I had spent years mapping, there were likely corrupting data with every failed reboot. It was a digital apocalypse, and the survivors didn't know how to rebuild. By afternoon, it was on the news. Major tech company Innovate Corp was experiencing a complete global outage. Their stock was in freefall. Pundits speculated about a massive cyber attack. I just sipped my coffee. The outage lasted for 3 full days. In this industry, a 3-day total outage isn't just an incident. It's an extinction-level event. Later, news reports and internal leaks pieced it together. The company was losing, on average, over $15,000 a minute. That's nearly $1 million an hour. Over 3 days, the direct losses were in the tens of millions, but the reputational damage was catastrophic. Customers were furious, contracts were canceled, and the company became a meme for corporate incompetence. They eventually had to fly in a specialist team from the hardware vendor, the very people I had told Brad to call for a simple inspection. They, along with expensive consultants, spent a week picking through the digital wreckage. And, of course, they tried to blame me. 2 weeks later, I got a letter from their legal department threatening a lawsuit for suspicion of sabotage. They were trying to make me the scapegoat. I hired a lawyer, but I wasn't worried. I hadn't done anything. My only crime was knowing the truth, and then, when they cast me out, keeping it to myself. The external investigation they were forced to conduct confirmed everything. The final report was a brutal indictment of Brad's management. It found my emails, my risk assessments, my warnings all logged. It noted that my custom monitoring scripts, which would have given early warning, had been decommissioned a month earlier as a cost-saving measure. The report concluded the disaster was not sabotage. It was gross mismanagement, a failure to adhere to standard industry practices, and the systematic dismissal of expert advice. It was human error, baked right into the corporate structure. Brad was fired, of course. So was his boss. The company issued a humiliating public apology and had to invest hundreds of millions to rebuild their hardware, their processes, and their shattered brand. By the time the dust settled, I was long gone. The day after the meltdown, I had my second interview with their biggest competitor. They didn't have to ask what happened. They saw the headlines and knew the person who could have prevented it was sitting in front of them. They didn't just offer me a job. They created a new position for me, Director of Infrastructure Resilience. They didn't just match my old salary. They doubled it, just as Brad had hysterically offered. They gave me a team, a budget, and a simple mandate. Make sure what happened to them never, ever happens to us. It was more than a job, it was validation. It was respect. Here, my experience wasn't a liability, it was the ultimate asset. My confrontational style was reframed as uncompromising diligence. I never heard from Innovate Corp again. They exist now as a cautionary tale whispered in server rooms about what happens when you value spreadsheets more than people. Do I feel guilty? Not for a second. I don't see it as revenge. I see it as an audit. I simply let the system fail in the exact way I had predicted it would. They didn't just disable my badge. They disabled their own ability to see what was coming. They chose to be blind. I just chose not to stop it. They had to learn the hard way that the most critical component in any system isn't the hardware or the software. It's the people who know what to do when the lights go out. So that's my story. What would you have done? Was I wrong to stand by and watch it burn? Or was it the only lesson they were capable of learning? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. I'm genuinely curious to hear what you think. In the end, they learned a brutal lesson about the real cost of undervaluing their people. And me? I learned my own value, and I will never let anyone disable it again. Thanks for listening.